Well, hey, AP Euro. I hope everybody is breathing a big sigh of relief now that the AP exam is finally over. As promised, I'm going to get started on the 1930s, that weird decade between World War I and World War II, or I should say one of those weird decades. And it was, of course, a time of the Depression, the rise of fascism. So, if you guys want to learn more about this time, which I highly recommend you do, I know that the test is over. I know the grading is weird right now, but this is an important concept to understand the rise of extreme politics, especially during times of crisis. I think it's pretty relevant right now, don't you think? Times are not normal right now. Everything feels weird. Politics and the economy are all changing. And so, if there's one thing I think everyone should know or should be able to understand and devote some study time to, it is the rise of extreme politics during times of economic, political, and social uncertainty. So the last time I left the video with you guys, it was the end of World War One. So let's take a look at what happens in the 1920s and 30s in Europe that leads to World War Two. So here on my website, of course, you guys can see chapter 26. It's called The Feudal Search for Stability, Europe Between the Wars of 1919 to 1939. So it covers this 20-year time period. And I have here some quotes about fascism. So some of you might be familiar with what fascism is, and some of you might think it's a brand new term. We learned about communism, and if you did not watch the video on the Russian Revolution, I highly recommend you do. But we have here, of course, this is Hitler and Mussolini, the dictators of Germany and Italy during the 20s and 30s. And I have here a whole bunch of resources, including the usual things that are always available. We have some information here on Lenin and his new economic policy. We'll be looking at the Soviet Union as well. A really interesting video about how Hitler rose to power. Highly recommend you watch that. Here is a look at World War II in color, which is pretty fascinating. Some people say that fascism is on the rise again. Extreme right-wing politics are on the rise again, especially in Europe, certainly in Italy today. So there's some articles on that, and then of course a video on Guernica and Soviet propaganda. So I'm going to be talking about all these things, not today, but in this upcoming unit. You might also want to get your reading packet. So here is the table of contents for the reading packet you would have been getting in class. So see, there's all these pictures of fascism, which is a pretty important topic here. And I would say for today, you could probably focus on number one, the road back in restless days. This is a look at post-war Germany and all of the struggles that German war vets were dealing with when they returned to Germany after the humiliation at Versailles. We're also going to look at the rise of extremism in France. So number three, the program of the Popular Front, also has to do with that. Now let's take a look at how politics are changing. Okay, let me get this here. I'll try to get through this quickly. So one thing that most people think of when they think of the 1930s is the Depression. So the Depression was everywhere, certainly in the United States. This is a picture of a Hooverville on the streets of the United States. Hoovervilles were basically homeless camps during the Great Depression, during the early stages before Franklin D. Roosevelt got elected. Hooverville being named after the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, whose policy was largely seen as a failure since he didn't really do anything to deal with the Great Depression. But this is coming at the tail end of the 1920s, which in the United States, we think of the 20s as the Roaring Twenties. Europe certainly experienced that to a certain extent, not as much as the United States, but in Europe, things were feeling a lot more uncertain. And that's because of the immediate impact of World War I being felt in Europe. 10 million people were dead after World War I, and that was just in a 4-year time span. Prior to World War I, it seemed as if progress was being made, at least in Europe, at home for the people of Europe. Can't say the same for the colonies, but this whole idea that progress was being made in, like, alleviating the situation for the poor, the war comes and it really, all of that shatters to pieces. Um, it was also just the indiscriminate and meaningless slaughter of the war itself. When it was over, many nations wondered what what was all for and why did we do that. Um, they started to doubt themselves, and this has a massive psychological impact. How did nations even buy into it because of propaganda? This leads to a lot of distrust of the established governments. Many people felt that they had been bamboozled or brainwashed. An entire generation of young people was lost, in particular young men, was lost to this war. A lot of the veterans who came home became pacifists. That means that they were anti war. And then a lot of the veterans also became actually more violent, more nationalistic, and more militaristic. So certainly there's a major interest here in the study of the psychology of war veterans as well. The immediate response back in Europe was to create war memorials and have ceremonies to remember those who gave their lives in the war. And also, like I said, there was suddenly an interest in studying war neuroses, also known as shell shock, which was what many soldiers came home with. The impact on their families also was massive. There's a lot of depression, as well as economic hardship, and an overall sense of meaninglessness and anxiety that many people felt during this time in Europe. This, of course, is mixing with the American influence of jazz music and new fashion and liberation movements. So, this combined with the sort of roaring 20s influence that gets imported from America is going to make for a very interesting couple of decades in Europe. So, a lot of countries are looking for security. They thought they could find it with the League of Nations, but the League of Nations turns out to be pretty weak, especially because one of the things that the League of Nations wanted to do was to promote disarmament, meaning reduce the number of weapons that countries had. It really seemed like militarism, the increasing the size and power of the militaries, was one of the causes of the war. And so people thought, well, if we disarm nations, not completely, but just reduce the number of weapons they have and the number of soldiers they have, maybe there will be less of a threat. But who was going to enforce that? Certainly no country wanted to be first to disarm, so no one did. France definitely did not want to disarm. They were still feeling very much threatened by Germany. And France was wanting to ensure that the Treaty of Versailles would be strictly enforced. This is going to become very difficult since nobody else is really willing to put in the work to strictly enforce it. The reparations that Germany was forced to pay totaled about 33 billion at the time. $33 billion for a country that had literally no money seemed like an impossible task to achieve. So Germany really wasn't able to pay the reparations at all. I mean, with what money, right? So this actually leads France to occupy a part of Germany. So the French military actually sends tanks and soldiers into Germany, a part of Germany called the Ruhr Valley, where there are a lot of mines. And the French actually put their own men, their French men, to work mining wealth literally out of German mines. This was basically France's way of saying, well, if you can't pay us, we're just going to come in there and literally dig money out of your own mines and we're going to take it back to France with us. And we'll consider this a payment. This puts German miners out of work as well, who during a time of economic depression, they couldn't really afford that. This creates rage in Germany against the French. This leads to, of course, the total collapse of the German mark, that's their currency, political unrest, massive inflation takes place as the government tries to deal with this by printing more paper money, which just causes a massive inflation and makes the problem even worse. It was during this time that the Nazi Party, which is mostly made up of World War I vets, led by one famous World War I vet, Adolf Hitler. And it was during this time that they actually tried to take power in Germany by overthrowing the government in the very famous beer hall push in Munich, Germany. We'll learn about that a little bit later. France also tries to make an alliance with some smaller countries that they think would be supportive, like Yugoslavia, which is a new country, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. These are countries that feel sort of threatened by Germany, and so France feels that they could be good little allies. Here's a picture of of German school children using bundles of worthless cash, worthless Deutschmarks, as building blocks. People also used it as wallpaper. It was so worthless that it was just cheaper to just burn it, use it for other things, anything other than money. There were some hopeful years, though. There were some times when, during the mid 1920s, where it seemed like perhaps some progress could be made. For example, the United States came up with the Dawes Plan, which was a plan to actually reduce the amount of money and the number of payments that Germany had to make. So that seemed to help a little bit. And then there was also the Treaty of Locarno, where some French and German ambassadors actually did try to come together in a spirit of cooperation and respect each other's borders. And so this seemed to be really, at first, kind of hopeful. This time period was called the spirit of Locarno, like the spirit of cooperation. And Germany even gets to enter the League of Nations in 1926. They also then decide that they're going to coexist peacefully with Soviet Russia. It was at this point other countries realized the Soviets are here to stay. Lenin isn't going anywhere. So they figured that they would simply just try to now negotiate and coexist peacefully with this new Soviet Union and this new Communist Party. But all this seemed to be going well, and then all of a sudden the Great Depression hits. So the Great Depression starts officially in 1929 when the stock market in the United States crashes. And when that happened, the United States begins to call in its loans that it had that it had given to Germany and Britain and other European countries. When, of course, they cannot pay, and back in those days, there was no such thing as financial insurance and bank insurance. Everybody lost their money. People lost their savings accounts, their retirement accounts. People lost their homes. And the situation went from bad to worse. The president at the time was Herbert Hoover, who very much believed in laissez-faire capitalism. So he believed that if he simply did nothing, if he simply allowed the market to correct itself, that everything would be fine eventually. That it might be a bumpy road, but eventually the market will simply correct itself and everything will be back to normal. That never happened. Actually, it went from bad to worse to then seeming like impossible to get out of. So he lost his next election. And of course, afterwards is defeated in the next election by Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt. But, this, of course, is going to come with some serious repercussions. Massive unemployment. People were desperate. The governments all seemed powerless. And one sort of government seemed especially powerless, and that was the Democratic governments. After all, Democratic governments vote, appeal, they negotiate, they have to work with party politics and figure out a way to cooperate with each other when they can't agree on anything. Democracy is not time efficient, right? Democracy is slow. And many people thought, we don't have time for this. We just want people to fix this. We don't want people to spend time arguing and voting. Let's just fix the problems. So many people started to question if democracy was even a valuable form of government. Is a dictatorship better in this situation? I don't know. What do you guys think? The ancient Romans certainly thought democracy was great, except in times of crisis. Whenever there was a war, for example, in ancient Rome, in the Republic, they would actually elect a dictator who would serve for a period of 6 months. And it was because having a dictator make decisions in a time of emergency seemed a lot better than taking time to vote on things while your city is literally burning to the ground. So, many people started to view extreme politics as much more favorable during this time. So here's an example of things that people were dealing with. Here's a bread line in Paris, but the same sorts of lines could be seen all over the world, including in the United States during this time. So World War I was supposed to make the world safe for democracy. It was supposed to get rid of all these, imperial problems and the monarchies and empires that had caused their large egos to use the young men of Europe as fodder to prove who was the best. World War I was supposed to be about democracy, about making the world for democracy, or at least that's what Woodrow Wilson said. But it seemed that democracy was struggling. So let's look at some of these democratic states. Number one is Great Britain. In Great Britain, the Labour Party is having a very difficult time trying to solve economic problems. Eventually, there was a coalition of liberal and conservatives that claimed credit for recovery. But actually, one of the things that had really been responsible for the partial economic recovery of Britain had been what is called state intervention by a famous British economist named John Maynard Keynes. So he is a leader in economic theory, and actually has a whole economic theory named after him today. He's called Keynesian economics. But John Maynard Keynes' theory was basically, if you want to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. In other words, if you want to make money, you have to spend money. The government has to literally spend money, even if it means going into debt, if it wants to recover economically. Franklin D. Roosevelt was a fan of this theory, and that's why he went with the New Deal. The New Deal was the programs that the United States created to literally create jobs out of thin air for people. And the governments spend billions and billions of dollars to create jobs to put people back to work. But not everyone thought that this was a solid plan. John Maynard Keynes, however, says this is the only way to really get a country to recover. This is still up for debate by economists and historians. In France, we see something a little bit different. In France, there had been decades of economic and political instability, and so we start to see the rise of extremism. One group in particular was called the Popular Front, which is formed in 1936, and it's actually a leftist coalition of socialists and radicals. The radicals actually were more like Democrats who owned property, and they were not really social, or they were not themselves were not communists at all. But there was a socialist leader named Leon Blum who creates his own version of the New Deal. He, being inspired by Franklin D. Roosevelt, creates a French New Deal, which is supposed to give relief to labor workers, things like 40-hour work weeks and overtime and workers' rights. But it may have had a small impact. It did not get rid of the economic depression in France. Likewise, the New Deal in America did not end the Depression. The Depression would not end until World War II. The Scandinavian states, however, had a very different experience. So when I say Scandinavia, we're talking about Sweden and Norway and Finland, Denmark. And these countries took a totally different approach. They haven't changed their economic systems much ever since, and actually are considered to be some of the more successful ones. So the Scandinavian states became social democracies. Think kind of like what Bernie Sanders has had become famous for, right? His alleged agenda. Social democratic governments, meaning that you pay a lot of taxes and there's large bureaucracies, but the government takes care of the people, right? There's things like free healthcare and all kinds of insurance and expansion of social services. So yes, the people pay large amounts of taxes, but those taxes go back to directly help all the people. These states were actually considered the most successful at the time in dealing with the Depression. And like I said, they haven't really changed their systems much. The United States also has a moment in the 1930s under the leadership of Franklin D. Roosevelt, where he takes on this active government intervention in the economy with his program called the New Deal, which is about creating programs that would either provide relief, give people money right when they needed it, recovery, which was to allow people to recover, so that would be like job creation, or reform the way the economy and the government worked. For example, Social Security was invented during this time. New labor laws were created during this time. Public works, the creation of public parks and bridges and canals and roads were built specifically not only to improve the infrastructure of the country, but also to create jobs for people who desperately needed them. It was a very slow recovery. The government of America spent billions on this program. It provided some relief. It did put people back to work, but it was not enough to get America out of the Depression either. There would still be unemployment and crises that would go on until America finally enters World War II. So, lastly, I'm going to talk about the colonies. So, during this time, Europe is still holding on to its colonies, and this is a problem. Remember, during our study of World War I, many colonies had been expecting to receive their independence. Many colonies, especially India, and as well as many African nations or African colonies, they believed, because they had been led to believe, that if they helped out during the war, if they enlisted in the army, or if they went ahead and went into those trenches in northern France and sacrificed their lives, that in return, their nations would be rewarded with independence, which is what they had been hoping for. Well, the war came and went, and when it was over, the colonies got nothing. There was no independence. And so many of them were very disappointed and angry. So this is, of course, very problematic in the Middle East, especially because the Ottoman Empire is gone. And now that the Ottoman Empire is gone, they have to have a makeover. Well, that's kind of hard to reinvent themselves now because Britain and France in particular are swooping in and taking some property, taking up territories and claiming colonies and mandates in the Middle East. The Middle East also did try to modernize and reform itself. Because if anything, World War I really exposes how backwards, how unindustrialized the Middle East had been. So they figured trying to modernize would be a good idea. For example, in 1932, Saudi Arabia declares its independence and remains an independent kingdom today, although Saudi Arabia is not known for being modern in every sense of the word. It's an interesting nation. In a weird way, it's like, you know, women's rights are virtually non-existent in Saudi Arabia, and there's a very strong patriarchy, but at the same time, it's very modern in the sense that, homes and cars are top luxury in Saudi Arabia. It's a very wealthy country, but also seems to be stuck in time in some ways. Iraq gains its independence from Britain as well, but very oil rich. Britain does not leave forever. Britain oil interests were still there. Turkey begins to secularize and to westernize. Ataturk, or also known as Mustafa Kemal, becomes the leader, and he wants to westernize Turkey. He figures westernization seems to be working for Western Europe and for the rest of the world, so for the rest of the westernized world anyway. So he tries to kind of remove Islamist rule. Women's rights suddenly became a thing in the Ottoman Empire, and he abolished aristocratic titles. He brought in popular education. So it's interesting to note that we have a certain image of the Middle East today, perhaps because it's embroiled and tangled up in so much religious and political turmoil, and has been taken over by religious extremists as well. But it is important to note that at the end of World War I, the Middle East was well on its way to modernizing and secularizing at a much faster rate than Europe had ever been. In fact, European influence was very strong in Lebanon and Jordan, Palestine, and Syria. India, by the way, goes through a remarkable transformation during this time. The leader of the Indian national independence movement was a man by the name of Mohandas Gandhi, or Mahatma, which means great soul. And he began a movement for independence and social justice in India. Indian people were treated very harshly by the British police forces and military in India. And in 1919, at the end of World War I, there was a deadly massacre in India called the Amritsar Massacre. This was actually a peaceful protest by unarmed protesters, including women and children. And it was met by deadly force with the British military forces that were there. 400 innocent and unarmed Indian civilians were killed by the British Army. This leads to a call for major change and independence. So Gandhi was known for civil disobedience. He believed in nonviolence, he believed in self-sacrifice, and he believed that breaking the law was the point of protest as long as one did so civilly and nonviolently. The symbol of his movement became the spinning wheel, which is actually today in the center of India's national flag. The spinning wheel because Gandhi actually made his own clothes. This was a sign of protest against the domineering British textile industry that had taken over India. Remember that India had had its own textile hand weaving manufacturers that had been destroyed or crushed when the British took over and forced their own cheaper factory made textiles onto the Indian market. Um, Gandhi's tactics actually later would inspire Martin Luther King, and he actually follows the whole idea of civil disobedience as well during the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the United States. In the 1930s, Gandhi staged an ultimate protest called the Salt March. This was because salt was also a product in India that had been taken over by the British. The salt mines in India were prohibited, right? They had been taken over by the British. And so Gandhi goes on a march for hundreds and hundreds of miles, and he's joined by lots of followers. And he goes to a salt march, he bends over and he picks up a piece of salt in a salt mine, which he was not allowed to trespass on, and he's arrested. That was the whole point, though, was to get arrested. You can't really challenge the law unless you get arrested. This is also known as the salt satyagraha, or self-sacrifice. And in getting arrested, he gains international attention. The whole world really condemned the British government for this. And by 1935, the British would grant India some limited internal self-government. India will not get full independence until after World War II. So here's a picture of Gandhi, as I said, on his spinning wheel. This was a sign of his independence from British colonial rule. And lastly, we have Africa. So African nations or African colonies were also very, very disappointed after World War I. Don't forget, many African and Indian soldiers fought and died in European trenches during World War I, and they had been promised their independence. When they don't get it, there's a lot of post-war activism and protest that takes place. There's a rise in African nationalism as Africans begin to demand sovereignty. Where did they get these ideas? Well, interestingly enough, many Africans, in particular higher class or wealthier Africans, had actually been schooled or educated in Western schools where they received a Western education, a European education. And what do they learn in European education? Ideas about the Enlightenment, ideas about democracy, self-government, and freedom. So they began to demand those things for themselves as well. Workers formed trade unions in countries like Nigeria and South Africa. There were some protests that actually turned violent. For example, in 1929 in Nigeria, there was a Nigerian women's protest where a group of unarmed women began to protest the treatment of Nigerian citizens at the hands of the European police. It turned into an anti-police and anti-white male protest. They actually demanded that all white men leave Nigeria during that time. You can imagine that this is probably because the white men who lived in Nigeria at the time were known for their mistreatment of the local population. In return, however, about 50 Nigerian women were murdered at this protest. So, after events like this, many African leaders began to call not for reform, they were done with reform. Now they want independence, and they're going to start calling for independence from Europe. And many of these calls for independence will turn violent, will turn militant. Some will be somewhat peaceful. We'll see the rise of something called Pan-Africanism, which is the unity of the African people in solidarity against European imperialism. They get their inspiration from some African American writers like W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and the Kenyan Jomo Kenyatta, who will later go on to become Kenya's first Black president. So I'm going to leave you guys here with these essential questions to discuss and post below in the comments. First of all, how do you think World War I really exposes the weaknesses and flaws of Western democracies? After all, Western democracy almost lost the world, right? What's coming now is World War II, the rise of extremism. The most powerful countries in the world will be that nearly took over the rest of the world will be Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, which was also fascist. So, this is the time when democracy is truly being tested. So, how do you think World War I really exposes the weaknesses and flaws of the Western democracies, especially during the Great Depression? And number two, what impact do you think World War I had on Europe's colonies in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia? How did these colonies kind of wake up a little bit after World War I? Why did they start to make the demands that they made? And what do you think this is going to cause for them? So I'm going to leave you with that. And I would appreciate your comments and your answers in the comments below. My next video is going to be on the rise of fascism in Italy under Mussolini.